Good evening and welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Judge Ashley Willcott filling in for Vinnie. After nearly 30 years in prison, a woman convicted of murdering her 2 children could have another chance at life on the outside. Tonight, the subject of our investigation is Susan Smith. Here is her story. On October 25th of 1994, 23-year-old Susan Smith reported to police that her car had been hijacked by a black man with her sons, Michael and Alexander, still inside. Community members and law enforcement frantically searched for the 2 little boys as Susan and her husband made TV appearances begging for the children's safe return. Then, 9 days later, Susan Smith confessed that she had rolled her car into a lake with Michael and Alexander still inside. Susan was charged with 2 counts of murder. At trial, a jury found her guilty, but spared her the death penalty. And since 1995, that is where she has remained. But now, after almost 30 years, Susan Smith is up for parole. Alexander and Michael Smith were missing for 9 days before Susan Smith's confession. And for 9 days, Susan kept up a facade in front of her husband, law enforcement, and the public, begging through tears for her children to be found safely, like in this interview that she did with WYFF back in 1994.
I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much.
Susan Smith has already been tried and convicted of her children's murders. So our investigation is not a question or if she did it. Tonight, we are asking why. Why did Susan Smith kill her children? Joining me to discuss a former prosecutor who prosecuted Susan Smith, Tommy Pope, and investigative reporter with Fox Carolina. She created a documentary on David Smith, the husband's fight for justice, called 30 to Life, A Father's Fight for Justice. Grace Runkle. Grace, Tommy, thank you so much for being with us. Tommy, let me start with you because I love having you on as one of my legal experts, but this is the first time we have got to talk about this case that you prosecuted. And let me just start with, how do you feel? What do you think when you hear that she's going to have a hearing to determine whether or not she'll be released on parole?
You know, Judge, unfortunately, I sought the death penalty. I felt it was the appropriate penalty based on her crime, based on her conduct. I wanted her to face the same punishment the black man, if there'd been a carjacker, would have faced. I wanted the same punishment if David Smith, the husband, had done it. Unfortunately, the jury chose to give life, and I respect that. But what ultimately happened, they weren't aware that 30 years later, you and I would be sitting here talking about her being eligible for parole. And so the jury thought she was going to jail for life. She was going to focus on Michael and Alex and you know, be remorseful for what she did. And we've seen by her conduct in prison, that's not the case.
I remember this case. I watched every piece of it unfold. I remember I was part of the public watching and thinking, what kind of person kidnaps 2 kids in a car or takes a car with 2 kids and dumps them into a lake? And then when her confession came out, I was absolutely blown away that a mother would do this. Grace, we know the father, David Smith, and calling for justice, seeking justice. What can you tell us about where he is with this, or what he's done throughout the years as she's been sitting in jail convicted of the murder of his 2 children?
Well, you know, for David, going back 30 years, it really has always been about keeping Michael and Alex, his sons, at the forefront. He says, you know, a lot of people like to think of him as a victim, but he says the true victims are Michael and Alex. And so he's really kind of spent the last 30 years reminding people about that. And when we first started to make contact with him, you know, to do this documentary, 30 to Life, he was saying how painful it is this year, especially, to go back and relive all of those memories from when the boys were missing, when he found out that they were murdered. But he said he needs to speak up for them now more than ever, because he says that if Susan were to get out, there would be no justice for Michael and Alex. So it's something he says he's been dreading this year for 30 years. A lot of the public wasn't aware that she was going to be up for parole, but of course, David Smith very much aware, and it's been very much on his mind now for 3 decades.
Well, I want to talk with both of you about the why. So let me again start with you, though, Grace, and say why. Why does David think she did this? Who does this? Who has their 2 children strapped in the back of a car and then rolls them into a lake for a really horrific death? What does he say about why she did this to their children?
You know, I don't think David really knows why. I think that's the question that everyone still has about this case, why people keep going back to it. He did tell us that looking back, she had always been manipulative, going back from when they first met, and he thinks, you know, a lot of the 9-day search, a lot of what she did, obviously manipulating him and the public and law enforcement. I know that she was attempting to get a boyfriend back at the time who wrote infamously in a letter that he did not want kids. That, of course, you know, Tommy can speak more to that, but the state argued very much weighing on her as to why she made this decision. But he also said that when he first spoke with Susan after she was arrested in Colombia when she was behind bars, he said that she apologized and that he still to this day does not think that she meant that apology. So as to why, I think he's still looking for that answer too.
All right, so Tommy, you and I have talked pretty frequently about the fact that motive is not an element of a crime. You don't have to know why. But we also know a jury wants to know why. Tell us about your prosecution in this case against Susan Smith and the why behind the murder of these 2 children.
Sure. You know, the difficulty we face from the beginning is that anytime, I mean, you've said it several times now, a mother killing children, something's got to be wrong. So Susan reminds us of our sister, of our co-worker. So people are uncomfortable. In a strange way, they're more comfortable if it had been the carjacker because it's not as unsettling to us in our everyday lives. But at the end of the day, Susan is selfish, and Susan decided that how erratic this decision was, that somehow she would have the opportunity to get this boyfriend back, as Grace said, who had written her this Dear Jane letter, if she didn't have kids. So her kids are in the car, her wedding album's in the car, her wedding dress is in the car. Always say everything but David was in the car. Now, the defense says it was a botched suicide, but, you know, we tested the vehicle down the steep ramp. If she had come to the house wet, if she had come to the house that she ran to injured from diving out of a car and just said, I was suicidal and I let my kids roll in, please go help them, because they floated for 6 minutes before they went under. She had that opportunity, but she chose to put herself first. The boyfriend's sweatshirt she had on that night, she told David during that 9 days that she expected him to come by. And at the end of the day, I think if you give up the kids, you're a bad mother. But if the carjacker takes your kids, then you're a victim, and there's more chance Prince Charming may come back in to rescue you. Yeah. And so I firmly believe that's the case, Judge.
And what made her confess after 9 days? Tell us a little bit more, Tommy, about that and why she, after 9 days, and again, I remember following this case for those 9 days, praying that something would be learned, and then she confesses.
Sure, and I thought during the thing, quite honestly, I didn't think the children would be killed. Obviously, the longer it takes, the more likely you are to recover them. I thought it was probably more of a domestic situation. A carjacker just doesn't take kids. Carjacker takes your car, takes your money, may take a female from a sexual assault standpoint. They're not taking kids. So even till the end, I thought there'd be some logical outcome. Maybe she had them hidden or something of that nature, but her story, you know, law enforcement runs a dual investigation. So they're looking for the black guy, they're looking for the car, they're looking for the kids, but they're also looking at David and Susan. They're doing polygraphs little by little. Her story wasn't meshing. A trigger point was the fact that the light she said she was in Monarch, which is right outside of Union, that there was nobody at the light that she was stopped at. That light would not be red but for a car being at the intersection. So they pursued that with her and said, could it have been somewhere else? And she flips and says, oh yeah, it was somewhere else. And so, it started unraveling. But I'll tell you, the media involvement, the media pressure, she went from enjoying the media and basking in the attention to not wanting to even do it. And the family's going, what do you mean you're not going to do it? We've got to find the kids. So when she, near the end, media like yourself started asking her some hard questions, and I think ultimately it broke her.
Wow, this case. All right, Grace, tell us about David and what he has said it was like for him to go through those 9 days, being questioned, being considered a suspect, because that's a normal investigation to look at those close to the children, and then hearing the confession, and now here we are awaiting a hearing to determine if she'll get parole.
Well, he said, again, he's been dreading this year for 30 years. It's really been weighing on him, and going back this year, having to relive it so many times has just, I can't even imagine how difficult that's been for him. But he also said that it is still great to hear how many people have been thinking about Michael and Alex after all of these years. And I think that's something that has been keeping him going. I know that he said the crime itself is unthinkable, but he says he can't even wrap his head around why the country really took up Michael and Alex as their own kids. I think that's really what gets him through these past 30 years, gets him through the upcoming parole hearing. But he also told us, he hasn't even begun to think about what life would be like if she got out. It's something that he says he should start to mentally prepare for, the possibility, but it's somewhere that he really doesn't even want to go to yet mentally.
Yeah, I can understand that. And when they're kids at the heart of a case, and the unthinkable happens, they disappear, I think all of America turns around the world, wants to know, because you think it could be you as well. So we are going to continue watching this. Thank you so much to Grace Runkle. Appreciate you. Tommy Pope will be staying with us. And coming up next, should Susan Smith get parole?
She doesn't deserve to ever be free again.
The case of Susan Smith.
The convicted killer became infamous after drowning her 2 young sons and then trying to mislead the public into thinking that they had been kidnapped. Now here we are. This woman is up for parole.
It's all about justice for Michael and Alex.
I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you stay behind bars.
The Susan Smith parole hearing. Live coverage Wednesday morning, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
Her only doing 30 years would be an injustice to Michael and Alex. She doesn't deserve to ever be free again.
That is Susan Smith's ex-husband, David, saying the woman who drove their children into a lake should never be released from prison. When the children were reported missing, David stood by his wife even when police were beginning to question her. Take a look at this interview the couple did with WYFF in 1994.
Right now, they have not been able to rule anyone out. I don't think I'm any more of a suspect than anyone in this case right now.
It's very painful to know that anyone would think that either of us had anything to do with this abduction of our children.
David spoke to our Court TV anchor Julie Grant at length, and he said as he looks back on that time in his life, he doesn't remember seeing any red flags from Susan.
I can look back now and see things that should have been red flags to me at the time, but at the time, Julie, I just wanted Michael and Alex back.
We know Susan's ex-husband doesn't think she deserves to be released, but it won't be up to him. It is the decision in the hands of a South Carolina parole board, which brings us to our next question. Should Susan Smith get parole? Still with us, Tommy Pope, and joining us, clinical and forensic neuropsychologist and author of the book, The New Rules of Attachment, Dr. Judy Ho. Judy, thank you for jumping in and joining us along with Tommy.
Tommy, the first thing I want to ask about is the reality of a parole board, because people need to understand it's not, oh, the prisoner goes in front of the parole board and the parole board subjectively decides do they get out or not. There are a list of legal requirements of things they must consider. It could be a little different in each state, but my understanding in South Carolina, Tommy, is that there are 5 different things that they have to consider for every prisoner that comes before them.
That is correct, and there's kind of a checklist. So in South Carolina, the parole board, there's 7 members. They're from all walks of life. It's much like a jury, Your Honor, but they have these criteria. But what they're going to hear, they'll hear kind of aggravation and mitigation. They'll hear, you know, from David, perhaps from Kevin Brackett, who took my place as solicitor. Hopefully, I'll have the chance to address them. They'll hear from Susan and anyone that chooses to speak on her behalf. And then the criteria are things like the behavior in prison, the nature of the crime, you know, the threat of the future bad behavior, things of that nature. And, you know, Susan's case is unique. I think, you know, I've had worse cases, you know, as far as prison behavior. I've had inmates who killed other inmates when they were in. And so her conduct really, to me, ties more into the jury believing that she was going to spend the rest of her life in prison and she was going to spend the rest of her time thinking about Michael and Alex. And what we know now is that the jury didn't know is she doesn't necessarily have to spend the rest of the time in prison, and she's been focused on herself, you know, sex with the guards, the social media aspects, she's got sugar daddies now that want to take care of her as soon as she gets out, and then you know, recently contact with the producer trying to work out some form of benefit for the nature of her crime.
All right, Dr. Judy, we have a lot to talk about on this case, but I want to start with, should Susan get parole, and focus really on the nature of the crimes that she was convicted for, murdering her 2 young children, as you know, in their car seats, strapped in. Tommy just shared with us earlier on the show that there were 6 minutes that they were floating, and she could have arguably gotten them back out of that vehicle, didn't do so. The nature of this crime, what does it tell you as a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist?
Well, Judge Ashley, like Tommy just mentioned, it's not so much that her conduct is so severely egregious when you consider the conduct of other prison inmates, but I think when you frame it in what she had already done and got convicted for, which is, of course, brutally killing her 2 children. And also, when she had that opportunity to save them, you have to think about the last moments of these children's lives, how they must have been feeling, the terror, the suffering they must have gone through. And that essentially, with this time that she's been in prison, she's been kind of having maybe at times a good time. Like, it sounds like she's making the most of her time, right? She's not somebody that appears to be remorseful. I think that is going to be a factor. I also think that it's going to be a factor that there were different theories about why this happened and why she decided to murder her children, and that it could have been because of her romance, because she wanted to be with this man that didn't want to have kids. So when you think about how brutal that is and how much that was self-centered in the first place, and then you look at her conduct in these last years, I think they're thinking, hey, this is the same person. This is not a person who has thought about what they did and wants to now become an empathetic and productive member of society.
Tommy, I want to turn back to something you just mentioned, and my question is, will the parole board consider or be able to consider what you mentioned? You sought the death penalty. That was not successful, but you said the jury didn't know that she could get out on parole or would have that opportunity. And so the jury believed at the time a life sentence meant she'd be in jail the rest of her life. Is any of that information something that the parole board will know or can know?
I think I'm comfortable that I would be able to share that with them. And again, you know, with a little legal research, obviously they could figure that out. The law changed in South Carolina in '96 and life started meaning life. But I think what I want to relate to them is important of what the jury believed. You know, I'm not disputing the law was what it was at the time, and you couldn't tell a jury. They didn't want them speculating on possibilities of parole in a death penalty case. So I respect that, but I also also, you know, I'm trying to tie it back to justice. It's kind of like David Smith said in this case, what is justice for Michael and Alex? And, you know, whatever that's why I sought the death penalty, whatever the most significant punishment that was available based on the totality of her conduct and the way, as Dr. Ho just said, that, you know, her self-centered focus, you know, I think that the phraseology in DSM, I think it's histrionic. She's either the princess or the victim, but it's always all about Susan. And so I want to share that with the jury. With the parole board, and let them know that that's what the jury was thinking, and that's what I hope justice will be.
And Dr. Ho, when you look at justice from your perspective, the lens of the neuropsychologist, and knowing what this woman's been convicted of, how do you define or look at that justice as she's coming up for a parole board hearing?
Well, I think that there's a lot of different factors, but when we think about the emotional factors, the psychological factors, it's sort of like, did she suffer enough for her crimes? And I would say that based on her conduct, people are going to say, no, she hasn't. I also think about, from my perspective as a forensic neuropsychologist, is she going to be a productive citizen of society, or is she likely to reoffend? I do think that some people really can. I do believe that there are some people who really look back on their behavior, they want to change their life. I don't know if we have evidence that this is where Susan is right now.
All right, thank you both so much. Tommy Pope, Dr. Judy Ho, we really appreciate you being with us. I'm Judge Ashley Willcott, in for Vinnie Politan. We will keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. It has been 30 years since 3-year-old Michael Smith and 14-month-old Alexander Smith tragically lost their lives at the hands of their own mother. Now, that mother's life is in the hands of a parole board who will determine if Susan Smith will ever see life outside of prison walls. Here is her story.
On October 25th of 1994, 23-year-old Susan Smith reported to police that her car had been hijacked with her sons Michael and Alexander still inside. Then, 9 days later, Susan Smith confessed that she had rolled her car into a lake with her children strapped to their seats. At trial, a jury found her guilty of 2 counts of murder, and she was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Now, Susan Smith has a chance at freedom as her day in front of a South Carolina parole board approaches.
On July 28th of 1995, Susan Smith was booked into the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. 5 years later, Susan Smith would tell prison administrators she had sex 4 times on prison grounds with 50-year-old prison guard Houston Cagle. Cagle pleaded guilty and served his own prison sentence for that crime. And then, the following year, prison captain Alfred Rowe confessed to having sex with Smith, and he was then sentenced to 5 years probation. Alfred Rowe joined Ashley Banfield on News Nation and discussed his affair with Susan Smith.
I don't know how I allowed it to happen. I guess being young, never being around that many women before, and then being basically locked up just like they were for 12 hours a day, I just fell into her sweet talk and manipulation, her cool demeanor, I guess.
There was one other detail I wanted to ask you about, and that was I've heard you say before that she was revered among the other female inmates. Do you have any idea why? Because typically child killers are not revered among other inmates.
Yeah, that was a puzzle to me too. But she didn't have any enemies. Nobody hated her. Nobody really disliked her. She had a small following of people that anytime you saw Susan, you would see those people right there with her.
On September 25th of 2000, Smith was transferred to the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, and that's where she has remained. And that brings up our question. What else do we know about Susan Smith's life in prison? Joining us to discuss, prison consultant, director, and founder of Wall Street Consultants, and the author of the book Lies My Lawyer Told Me, Larry Levine, and criminal defense attorney in South Carolina, John Mobley. Thank you both for being with us. I want to give a little more context before we discuss. Since being transferred to the institution, Smith has racked up a number of disciplinary sanctions. According to her inmate record, she has had the following sanctions since being at Leith. In 2024, communication with a victim and/or a witness of a crime. 2015, use or possession of narcotics, marijuana, or unauthorized drugs. 2012, unauthorized use of an inmate's PIN, that's a personal identification number. 2010, mutilation. 2010, use or possession of narcotics, marijuana, or unauthorized drug. 2010, use of possession of narcotics, marijuana, or unauthorized drug. And then an incident report about Smith's most recent disciplinary sanction reads, inmate Smith has been using this system to communicate with a news reporter journalist. The conversations clearly discuss conducting an interview and even filming for a documentary and ways to get paid for it. The media person involved in these calls has deposited money into inmate Smith's account for calls and canteen. All right, let us stop there. John, let me start with you, please, if I could. Okay, so at the end of the day, these are minor infractions. It is true some people in prison might kill another person while they're in prison. She has not done anything rising to that level. But what does it say to you, John, that she's got all these different violations? Does that affect whether or not she should get out on parole?
You know, actually, I got to call it like I see it. I mean, obviously, it's something they're going to consider. However, I think to put things in context, she served almost 11,000 days in prison. So I think that, to be fair, if you take someone that's 23, 24 years old, and you stick them in prison and tell them they're going to serve a life sentence, I'm pretty sure they're going to have some bad days. So I'm very hesitant to pass judgment on minor infractions over the course of 30 years. I think, once again, anybody is going to have some bad days, and they're probably going to do certain things that they do just to kind of get through sometimes, which is going to involve conduct that may not be something that involves the best judgment. You know, as far as having sex with the guards, I mean, technically, she did not commit a crime. The guards are the ones that committed the crime. So arguably, you know, although that one individual wanted to lay it all on her and say she was a manipulator and she was so cool, I mean, he's the one that had the power. You know, so you could argue that they actually took advantage of her because she is the inmate and they have the power, they have the authority. I mean, I think as far as marijuana use goes, I don't use marijuana, but I mean, you have 17, 18-year-old kids use marijuana. So I think they kind of really make a significant, you know, deal out of the fact that over 30 years, this 23, 24-year-old girl serving a life sentence, or what she thinks may be a life sentence. I don't put a whole lot of weight on that as far as being a significant factor in her release.
Yeah, and I will say this, if people want to know what it's like in prison, it's just like it is outside of prison in terms of the things available to prisoners, things that happen in prison, the drugs, the sex, all of these things. Yeah, they happen there. Larry, weigh in and also talk to me about this, because the reality is some of these infractions, I read through what happened to her as a result. And again, these aren't criminal charges, but rather infractions while she's serving her life sentence. And some of these things resulted in 6 months with no telephone telephone privileges. 6 months. And you might think that would be enough to make a person say, I'm not going to do that again, because 6 months without telephone privileges arguably is a pretty severe consequence. But weigh in on this, Larry.
I agree with a lot with what the lawyer had to say. Okay, someone who's serving essentially a life sentence, they have nothing. You look at the people that will kill other inmates, beat other inmates up, commit assault, they have nothing to lose. What difference does it make? She knows or believes she's never getting out, so she is doing whatever she can to survive. But on the other hand, she also knows the policy. She knows the policy very well. She's been there for 30 years. And I think that if they let her go, and I'm not taking sides either way, I did 10 years myself in 11 different prisons. But I think it would set an example to the other inmates. Well, gee, you could go and kill people. You could kill your children, come to prison, violate any policies you want, and then you become parole eligible. I think the Mendez brothers are probably closer. Well, I don't know if they're going to get parole or not, but at least they complied with prison policy. Remember, somebody who's getting parole, they're still under arrest. If you violate parole, they can just grab you back up, bring you back in. They don't have to arrest you. She's already shown that she cannot follow policy. So there's a likelihood is that she may get violated rather quickly and come back in. I mean, who knows what she's going to do? She's not mentally stable. She didn't get any better while. I mean, a stable, normal person doesn't go and kill two of their kids.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to.
She's not going to make it on the outside.
And I'm going to come back to that legal point with you, John, in just a moment, the actual crime she committed. But while we're talking, let me ask you, Larry, one more thing. And what is it like? You're a prison consultant. What might it be like for her having killed children? That's the worst thing you can do from what you hear, and then going to prison for that crime, that conviction, those murders. What must it be like for her?
Okay, two people are the most hated kind of people in performance, the rats. No one wants to do anything with them, associate with them. And then people that like to play with kids, chomos, child molesters. I mean, she killed kids. She's not in a men's prison. If she was in a men's prison, somebody probably would have stuck her and killed her by now. You know, it's a bunch of women. You're not going to have the same type of environment that you're going to have in a men's prison. I'm sure she's made some friends since she's been in there. Probably other lifers, people that have an out date, they're getting out eventually, I would tend to say want nothing to do with her. I mean, she's not a well-liked inmate. And as far as having sex with the guard, the correctional officer, she knew that was against policy. She knew everything she was doing against policy. We're not talking about some kid here. She's doing what she has to do to survive, but she has a history of breaking policy. And that's not going to play favorably with any type.
All right, John.
At all.
And John, we know that she's had a number of different jobs while she's been in prison: library helper, landscape laborer, food service aide, et cetera, et cetera. And does that, in your mind, make a difference for she's doing those jobs? Does that mean necessarily she's going to go out and, if she's out on parole, actually start working and doing jobs like this?
No, I mean, it doesn't mean that at all. I mean, she's got to do something in prison. Everybody does. And I think she's going to have a hard time getting hired by anybody. I think what will be a significant factor in her favor is if at the parole hearing, there are potential employers that are willing to give statements or sign affidavits and or testify that once she is released, she will have a place to work. You know, whenever I have a client and I'm trying to persuade a judge to let them out on parole, give them probation, or something like that, what I like to demonstrate is that once they leave and they transition to the real world outside of prison, they're going to have some structure, a place to live, someone's going to hire them, because those factors, that structure, that stability, maybe it's a family network of friends and family, that is going to make it less likely for them to reoffend. But if someone has been in prison for their entire adult life, They really have forgotten how to function in the outside world. And when they transition to the outside world, if they don't have a job, if they don't have some kind of family support, they're going to go right back to committing the same crimes that they did that led them to prison in the first place.
And I see Larry nodding along. Thank you so much, Larry. We always appreciate hearing from you. John's going to stay with me. Still to come, what is going to happen at the parole hearing?
In my capabilities, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you stay behind bars.
This case clearly on the national forefront, brutal murder of this young woman, Laken Riley.
Investigators say she was beaten to death while going on a run.
This is a heartbreaking time for the university. We have a suspect in custody, Jose Antonio Ibarra. He did not know her at all.
Such a violent, unprovoked act. Will there be justice for Laken Riley?
The murder of Laken Riley. Live coverage weekday mornings, only on Court TV.
Susan Smith will soon be in front of a parole board in South Carolina. So what exactly is parole? According to South Carolina Department of Corrections, parole is the early release of an inmate from the Department of Corrections to the supervision of the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services. The inmate will continue to serve his or her sentence under the department's supervision until the remainder of the sentence is satisfied. And that brings us to our final question. What is going to happen at the parole hearing? And joining us, a former prosecutor who prosecuted Susan Smith, Tommy Pope, and still with us, attorney John Mobley. All right, let's start with you, Tommy. We read the formal definition and what happens at that hearing, but tell us what really happens. Are you there, the former prosecutor? Is a prosecutor there who presents the information to the parole board, or do they have a big old file for Susan Smith that they get to go through and look at everything?
I think there's probably a little bit of everything. Traditionally, when I was the solicitor, I would just send a letter to the parole board that said that I believe in truth in sentencing. The individual received a life sentence. I believe that's what they should serve. But in this instance, having spoken to David Smith and knowing how important it is, that's why I'm headed back there with him to relate the things we've discussed before, that the jury believed it was life. The jury believed she should focus on Michael and Alex, and that hadn't happened.
And let me ask, as we're looking at this, John, my understanding, and Tommy, you'll jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding, though, is Susan Smith herself will appear virtually, but that the victims, Tommy, let me just ask yes or no of you, the victims can choose to appear in person or can be virtual. Is that correct, Tommy?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
All right, John.
That's exactly correct.
John, what do you think of that? The fact that, she's going to be virtual, well, she's convicted of the murder of her 2 children and in jail, so maybe that's an appropriate thing. And then the actual family members can be there in person if they choose to.
Yeah, if I was her attorney, I'd be jumping up and down objecting, just saying that's just blatantly unfair. I mean, you have to know that a live person is going to have a much more substantial impact and an effect on the board than a virtual appearance. It's just not the same. And if there's any advantage whatsoever to, being in person or appearing live, then she needs to be afforded that opportunity.
Well, that's an interesting argument, because I still get stuck on the fact she's convicted of killing her 2 children. Again, when you're joining us, just remember they were in their car seats in the back. They were buckled in. The car was pushed into the lake, Tommy, 6 minutes before they were submerged. So arguably they could have been rescued certainly during that time. But Tommy, talking again about what's going to happen at the parole board, my understanding also is, and I'd like you to speak to this, that you can see as many as 65 cases in a day before the parole board of 65 different people that they have to consider.
I think there's, obviously a great wait. I know there's a lot of letters that came in. I do want to point out to John's benefit, he's virtual now, and I thought he's being very convincing. So I'm not sure we need to move Susan from the prison and bring her over. So I think that they could do just fine with the video. But you're right, Your Honor, they're going to have a number of cases to be heard. I'm under the impression that they will start Susan's before, just because of the potential for, numerous witnesses that some other folks may have. John may be able to weigh in. Someone had asked me, I didn't know if traditionally defendants did have attorneys appear for them that may appear live, and John may have had more experience in that.
And it's funny because that was one of my questions along, John, with this. I understand, again, in South Carolina, 8% approximately of individuals that come up for parole are released on parole. That's a low number, obviously. So, John, I think most attorneys are going to argue they want to be there. But on the other hand, the defense attorney no longer represents them, I don't think, because they've been convicted. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and oftentimes, people do hire attorneys to represent inmates at parole hearings. And I think you definitely have a substantially higher probability of being released because you have someone that can make an organized presentation on your behalf, someone that could talk to you about your demeanor, someone that could advocate for you, someone that could put together the things that I recently talked about. For example, if you have an inmate being released on parole, they don't know what to say, but they're sorry and kind of want to go home. When I represent someone in a situation like that, again, I like to show the parole board that once this person transitions to private life outside of prison, they're going to have structure. They're going to have family support. They're going to have people in the community that support them. They're going to have a job. They're going to have a stable place to live while they get back on their feet and transition back to normal life. Because what that demonstrates is they have a lower likelihood of recidivism and returning to the same illegal conduct that put them in prison in the first place. Because what can happen when a person transitions from a substantial period of incarceration back to outside of prison life, they got to find a job. That's going to be hard. If you can't find a job, you can't find a stable place to live, if you don't have any support, those are the types of circumstances that lead people to go back committing crimes, doing drugs, doing things to cope, doing things to make money, selling drugs, illegal activity. And I think the parole board has a higher probability of releasing someone when they see they're less likely to reoffend.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Tommy, just weigh in quickly. I think the reoffending risk is something that frequently means prisoners are not getting out.
Yeah, and I don't see Susan rolling 2 more kids in the lake. I think it's more for me and David, obviously, about the punishment that equates to the crime, and that's something they'll look at, and hopefully she will not be getting paroled tomorrow.
We're going to find out. Thank you to our guests, John Mobley and Tommy Pope. We appreciate all your expertise in joining us tonight. 30 years ago, Susan Smith did the unimaginable. Her 3-year-old and 14-month-old sons counted on their mother to protect them. They counted on her to keep them safe, which is what she should have done. Instead, she strapped them helplessly into their car seats, let her car roll into a lake, and let her precious boys drown. She lied to her family, the police, and a nation for 9 days, saying somebody took her children, kidnapped her children. And now she could soon be a free woman living her own life with all the freedoms on the outside after taking the lives of her own 2 beautiful young sons. I'm Ashley Willcott in for Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.